At 0600 hours on March 23, 1943, Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen stood in a dusty forward command post 3 miles west of El Guitar, Tunisia, his field glasses locked on a chilling sight. 50 German tanks rolling out of a narrow mountain pass. The morning air was crisp, the desert sun just starting to glow, and the visibility was crystal clear. Allen could see every metallic glint on those panzers as they thundered down from the hills like a steel avalanche heading straight for his men. These were not green recruits, they were the same German veterans who'd bulldozed across 3 continents with terrifying precision. Just 27 days earlier, American troops had been crushed at Kasserine Pass, losing 6,500 men and retreating 50 miles in pure chaos. It was a brutal defeat, humiliating and broadcast for the whole world to see. The Germans mocked American soldiers as weak. The British whispered doubts, wondering if Americans could even fight. Back home, U.S. newspapers screamed the headlines, painting a grim picture of an army still learning how to survive. But now, everything had changed. The same Americans who had stumbled through Kasserine were dug in deep across the El Guitar Valley, ready to face the infamous 10th Panzer Division head-on. Their orders were simple: hold the line, or die trying. Major General Allen, the fiery commander of the 1st Infantry Division, known proudly as the Big Red One, had spent 9 long months whipping these men into shape. From the training camps of the U.S., to the endless drills aboard troop ships, to the barren fields of North Africa, he'd seen their fears, their potential, and their grit. Sure, they were untested. But Allen knew something the Germans didn't. These boys were Americans, and Americans never back down. Still, the world was watching. Could his men finally prove themselves under fire? Could they rewrite the story of Kasserine and show what U.S. soldiers could really do when led right and trusted to fight? The German attack came exactly as expected, a perfectly timed storm of Panzer Mark IVs, Marder tank destroyers, and half-tracks loaded with infantry. Dust clouds rose like thunder as the Axis columns advanced with that same deadly confidence that had crushed Poland in 3 weeks and France in 6. It was the same brutal formula that had sent Americans running a month before. The Germans were sure history would repeat itself, but this time, they were wrong. Because the army facing them now was not the same one that had been beaten at Kasserine Pass. In just 27 days, the U.S. Army had undergone a transformation that stunned even its own generals, faster, tougher, and sharper than any Allied force had managed in 3 long years of war. That transformation had started weeks earlier, in the unforgiving Atlas Mountains of Tunisia. On February 19, 1943, the Desert Fox himself, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had launched a surprise offensive against American positions at Kasserine Pass, a narrow 2-mile gap through the Grand Dorsal mountain chain. Whoever controlled that pass controlled the gateway through the entire region, and Rommel knew it. The Americans defending Kasserine were brand new to the fight, most having never even heard a bullet whistle pass their heads. They had just landed in North Africa as part of Operation Torch, the grand Allied invasion meant to squeeze the Axis from the west. But their inexperience showed. Their commander, Major General Lloyd Fredendall, had scattered his forces across the mountains in tiny, isolated groups with no mutual support, what the army called penny packets. Each little group fought alone, uncoordinated, easy prey for German armor, and their tanks, the M3 Lees and M3 Grants, were outdated metal coffins compared to the sleek, deadly panzers bearing down on them. That failure at Kasserine would sting the American army to its core and spark one of the fastest military turnarounds in history. The American M3 tanks were easy prey. Their tall frames stood out like walking billboards on the battlefield, just begging to be hit. Each one carried a 75mm gun awkwardly stuck into a side sponson and a 37mm cannon up in the turret, a clumsy design born from panic, not perfection. They were built fast, not smart, and it showed. The commanders inside those steel beasts had never faced real German armor before. Their only practice had been war games back home in Louisiana or the Mojave Desert, nothing like the firestorm waiting for them in Tunisia. Out here, the German panzers were faster, stronger, and commanded by men who'd already crushed armies in Poland, France, and Russia. They were veterans of lightning war, and they moved with the calm precision of killers who knew exactly what they were doing. Meanwhile, the American infantry barely knew how to dig in. Most had scraped out shallow trenches, not realizing that German tanks would roll right over them and twist their treads to crush anyone trying to hide beneath the dirt. That lesson was learned the hard way in blood and screams when Rommel unleashed his attack. Within hours, the entire American line shattered like glass. German armor ripped through Kasserine Pass, slicing apart defenses that were never truly connected in the first place. Italian troops following behind swept through the chaos, capturing American artillery before most gunners even saw them coming. General Fredendall's units were scattered and helpless, out of range, out of touch, and out of luck. Communication was a total disaster. Artillery batteries would only respond to their specific observers, but those spotters were on different radio frequencies, cut off from the units begging for help. Air support? Non-existent. No coordination, no shared maps, no system to tell who was where. Some desperate soldiers even retreated straight into German positions without realizing it until it was too late. By the night of February 16th, 1943, the U.S. II Corps was in ruins. They'd lost 1,600 men, almost 100 tanks, 57 half-tracks, and 29 artillery pieces. And that was just the beginning. The retreat dragged on for another 5 brutal days. Rommel's forces stormed forward, chasing the Americans across 50 miles of desert. Town after town, Sidi Bou Zid, Le Kef, Fariana, all fell into Axis hands. The U.S. troops left behind mountains of abandoned equipment. Tanks, guns, trucks, even rations. Anything to move faster and stay alive. British units fighting beside them didn't fare much better, losing all 11 of their tanks. By the time Rommel finally stopped his advance on February 22nd, the Americans had taken a staggering hit: 6,500 casualties in total. Around 300 were killed, 3,000 wounded, and another 3,000 simply vanished, captured, or missing. They'd also lost 183 tanks, 500 trucks and vehicles, 104 half-tracks, and 208 artillery guns. In contrast, the Germans lost fewer than 1,000 men and only 34 tanks. It was a one-sided slaughter, the worst defeat the U.S. Army had suffered in the entire war. The humiliation was global. British officers whispered doubts about American skill and discipline, while German commanders mocked them openly. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the top Axis commander in the Mediterranean, even told Hitler that U.S. soldiers were poorly trained and poorly led. That message hit like a gut punch in Washington. Kasserine Pass became a crisis point for the entire American war effort. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander in North Africa, had to face a hard question. Could the United States really stand toe-to-toe with the German army? Or would they always have to hide behind British leadership to win this war? The answer would shape everything from strategy in Africa to the dream of invading France. If American troops couldn't prove themselves here, in the North African desert, how could anyone trust them to lead the charge into Europe? Even Winston Churchill, ever the realist, had begun to doubt. After Kasserine, he wasn't sure if the U.S. Army was ready for what lay ahead. And for a while, it looked like Churchill's doubts were dead right. British commanders Bernard Montgomery and Harold Alexander took one look at the shattered American forces and declared them hopeless, untrained, poorly led, and far from ready for real war. They figured these green troops would need months, maybe years, before they'd ever stand up to the Germans. But Dwight D. Eisenhower wasn't buying it. He saw something everyone else had missed: the spark hiding inside the wreckage of Kasserine Pass. Yes, the Americans had been beaten, but not broken. In that disaster, Ike spotted small moments of raw courage. Some U.S. units had stood firm even when surrounded, and once the American artillery finally got its act together, it tore into the German lines with such power that even Rommel's men had to pull back. The weakness wasn't in the soldiers, it was in the leadership, the strategy, and the organization, and those could be fixed fast. So on February 26, 1943, Just 2 days after Rommel pulled out of Kasserine Pass, Eisenhower kicked off one of the fastest and fiercest transformations in modern military history. What happened next turned humiliation into redemption in just 27 days. Eisenhower's first move was ruthless. He fired Major General Lloyd Fredendall without hesitation. By March 6th, Fredendall was gone, and honestly, no one cried about it. His leadership had been a disaster. He'd set up his headquarters 70 miles behind the front lines, hiding in a canyon like it was some kind of fortress. Engineers had even blasted tunnels into the rock to protect him from air raids. While his men bled in the desert, their general was sitting underground, safe and sound. Eisenhower later said it was the only time in the entire war I saw a senior commander more worried about his own safety than the battle itself. Omar Bradley was even harsher. He called Fredendall's setup an embarrassment to every hin. American soldier! Fredendall had barely seen the battlefield with his own eyes. He didn't know the terrain, didn't understand his enemy, and worst of all, he had split his divisions into tiny, disconnected groups spread across 50 miles of desert, a setup doomed to fail. The moment the first German tank rolled in, Eisenhower knew he needed a man who could rebuild confidence fast, someone fearless, demanding, and unshakable. So he made a bold call. Major General George S. Patton. At 57 years old, Patton was a cavalryman who'd been waiting his whole life for this kind of war. He'd studied every tank battle, drilled every maneuver, and dreamed of this moment. When he took command of 2nd Corps at precisely 1,000 hours on March 6th, 1943, he had just 17 days to turn chaos into an army ready to fight again. Patton knew one thing better than anyone. Soldiers will die for a commander they fear and respect. He needed both, and he wasted no time proving it. Discipline came first, and it came hard. Every single soldier in 2nd Corps was ordered to wear a clean, complete uniform at all times. Even in the desert heat, helmets polished, boots laced, leggings tight, and insignia sharp. Anyone caught without proper gear faced court-martial. Officers who let their men look sloppy were stripped of command on the spot. Patton didn't just bark orders, he enforced them personally. He roared through American positions in his jeep, stopping to inspect soldiers' uniforms, rifles, and foxholes. He'd quiz troops on their weapons, their orders, even their rations. No one was safe from his gaze. He fined officers $50 for skipping a necktie and made enlisted men redig their foxholes if they weren't deep enough. He was everywhere, all the time, pushing harder, yelling louder, demanding perfection from men who barely had time to sleep. The soldiers couldn't stand him. They called him Old Blood and Guts, a tyrant obsessed with appearances. Officers grumbled that he cared more about neckties than Nazis. But behind that fire and fury, Patton was shaping something powerful, an army that finally looked, moved, and fought like it meant business. Some soldiers rolled their eyes, thinking Patton was out of his mind, more obsessed with shiny boots than bullets. They whispered, "Does this guy even know we're going to war? Not a fashion show?" But Patton knew exactly what he was doing. What those soldiers didn't yet understand was that discipline wasn't about looking good, it was about thinking sharp. To Patton, a sloppy army was a doomed army. If a man didn't care about how he wore his uniform, how could he be trusted to care for his rifle or his tank? If an officer couldn't enforce the smallest rule like a clean shave or a tied boot, how could he be trusted to keep his men alive under fire? Patton believed that excellence started from the outside in. The visible built the invisible. He wasn't obsessed with neckties, he was obsessed with standards. He was teaching his soldiers that order on the surface would breed order in the fight. Precision in dress would create precision in action. He was rewiring the entire culture of the I-2 Corps from the ground up, turning it from a scattered, beaten mess into a machine that ran on pride and precision. And the change came fast, shockingly fast. Within those 17 days, everything started to click. Units that had been disorganized and discouraged began to move like one body. Morning formations turned razor-sharp. Soldiers started taking pride in their gear. Rifles gleamed, boots shined, uniforms pressed. Vehicles were checked daily, weapons cleaned and inspected like sacred tools. Radio operators drilled nonstop, mastering clear communication so no one would ever again be lost in the chaos of crossed frequencies. Squad leaders rehearsed maneuvers until they could move as one. Platoon leaders studied the terrain, walking every inch of ground where they might fight, planning lines of fire and fallback routes down to the meter. The old sloppiness, that casual, careless attitude that had haunted them at Kasserine Pass vanished. The same men who once fled in panic now stood taller, ready, proud. They began to believe again in their leaders, in their mission, and in themselves. And that was Patton's real magic belief, because when an army believes it can win, it fights like it already has. Confidence became their new weapon. The II Corps started to look professional, and soon, it began to act professional. Patton gave his soldiers something they had never truly had before: faith in their own strength. Through sheer discipline, through impossible standards, and through his own unshakable confidence, he forged that belief into their bones. In his eyes, Americans, when trained right and led right, could beat any army on earth. And deep down, his men started to believe it too. While Patton rebuilt the soul of the army, Eisenhower rebuilt its brain. He knew the disaster at Kasserine hadn't just been about bad luck, it was a failure of systems, not spirit. The U.S. Army's entire way of fighting needed to evolve. The first overhaul was artillery, because when it worked, American artillery was unstoppable. The guns were world-class, the ammo stockpiles huge, and the gunners deadly accurate. But coordination? That was the missing piece. Before Kasserine, every artillery battery was basically fighting on its own little island. Each unit had its own observers, its own radio channels, its own rules. If a forward observer from the 3rd Battalion spotted enemy armor but needed support from 2nd Battalion's guns, he couldn't call them different frequencies, different chains of command. It was madness. Even when American guns were close enough to help, they often stayed silent simply because communication didn't connect. That's why U.S. artillery couldn't match the terrifying synchronized barrages the Germans used to tear through defenses. They could hit hard, but not together. Eisenhower's command saw it clearly now. It wasn't just about courage or skill. It was about fixing the machinery of war itself. And under his leadership, the U.S. Army was about to learn how to turn every gun, every tank, and every soldier into one unstoppable force. German artillery had been deadly for one brutal reason: coordination. Their forward observers could call in fire from any battery within range, summoning sudden, crushing waves of explosions that wiped out entire positions in seconds. They didn't just shoot, they synchronized destruction. So when the smoke cleared from Kasserine Pass, Eisenhower's team knew exactly what needed fixing: first, communication. Within just 1 week of that disaster, his staff started building a brand new fire direction system that would unite every artillery gun under one network. No more scattered batteries or crossed frequencies. From now on, every gun would speak the same language of war, but getting there wasn't easy. The technical problems were massive. Every artillery battalion had its own radios, its own procedures, and officers trained to think small, just about their own battery. Not the whole fight. It was chaos disguised as structure. Eisenhower's men tore that system apart. They rolled out new radio equipment, rewrote field manuals, and retrained officers from the ground up. The biggest change wasn't the hardware, it was the mindset. Artillerymen had to start thinking like team players in a corps-wide symphony of firepower. By early March, the new system was already being tested in live fire drills. By mid-March, when Patton's 2 Corps marched back into combat, those gunners were running fully coordinated missions, every shell landing with precision and purpose. And the results were electric. When U.S. units stayed tight and focused, their artillery became a storm no army could stand against. At El Gatar, this new system would roar to life, and it would change everything. But artillery wasn't the only piece Eisenhower's team had to rebuild. The real puzzle was armor, because America's tank doctrine had been completely wrong. Before Kasserine Pass, American commanders still thought like cavalrymen on horseback. The rule was simple: tanks fought other tanks. The logic came straight from the old cavalry mindset: knights charging knights, steel meeting steel. But this thinking was outdated and deadly. So when American tanks rolled out to meet the panzers head-on, they were walking into a trap. The Germans were masters of armored warfare. Their commanders had survived Poland in 1939, crushed France in 1940, and battled across the endless plains of Russia since 1941. They knew how to use the land, how to set ambushes, how to focus fire where it hurt the most. American tank crews, on the other hand, had only trained in the deserts of California and the plains of Texas against each other. They'd never seen the real thing. In battle, they advanced in straight lines, exposed their flanks, and fought as individuals instead of a single, coordinated force. The result? Disaster. At Kasserine, U.S., tanks were picked off one by one, burning across the desert because they charged in blind and alone. That humiliation forced a total rethink. Eisenhower's staff ripped up the old manuals and rewrote U.S. tank doctrine from scratch. From now on, tanks weren't dueling weapons, they were mobile fire support for the infantry. Instead of rushing forward to trade shots with panzers, American tanks would roll with the foot soldiers, use terrain for cover, and work side by side with artillery and tank destroyers. The job of killing German tanks would now belong to specialized units' tank destroyers. This was revolutionary thinking. The U.S. Army had already built tank destroyer battalions fast, mobile guns with incredible armor-piercing power. But at Kasserine, those units had been chopped into little platoons and scattered all over the place. Each one fought alone and got wiped out or bypassed. The new plan changed that completely. From now on, when where tank destroyers would fight as full battalions, united, focused, and concentrated where the enemy hit hardest. It meant rewriting battle plans, retraining officers, and forcing tank and infantry commanders to cooperate in ways they'd never done before. But it also played perfectly to America's strengths: speed, flexibility, and firepower. The U.S. Army was learning fast, and with every adjustment, it was turning into something far more dangerous, a force that could outthink, outshoot, and outlast the Germans themselves. By now, the Americans had the pieces and finally the plan. Their artillery could crush anything that moved, pounding German tanks into silence before they ever reached firing range. Their new tank destroyers were built to finish the job fast, mobile, and deadly accurate. They didn't need to beat the Germans at their own game anymore. They just had to change the rules. Next came air power, the hardest and slowest reform of all. Coordinating aircraft with ground troops wasn't as simple as a few radio calls. It required new frequencies, new training, and an entirely new way of thinking. Ground commanders had to trust pilots they couldn't see. Pilots had to strike targets just yards away from their own men. One mistake meant disaster. It would take over a year, not until Operation Overlord in June 1944, before the system reached perfection. But Eisenhower didn't wait. In March 1943, he laid the groundwork for what would become one of America's greatest battlefield advantages. He created air liaison officers, trained airmen embedded directly with ground units. Their only mission: connect the sky to the earth. They learned how to call in strikes, mark enemy positions, and coordinate with fighter bombers overhead. For the first time, air power and ground forces were learning to move as one. Eisenhower also drilled a single rule into every commander's head: no army advances without owning the sky. Air superiority wasn't a luxury anymore. It was survival. Then came the most radical change of all the command structure. Before Kasserine Pass, Fredendall's setup had been a disaster. He'd chopped his divisions into tiny, independent combat commands, leaving them isolated across the desert. That fragmentation gave the Germans every opportunity to attack one unit at a time and tear them apart. Eisenhower scrapped that system overnight. From now on, divisions would fight as divisions. Units would never be left hanging without support. Every combat command stayed under direct divisional control, and every division stayed close enough to reinforce its neighbors. No more lonely battles, no more broken lines. Every soldier would know that help was always within reach. And as these sweeping reforms rolled out, Patton's boot camp of discipline was working in perfect sync. While Patton was out in the field, inspecting foxholes, barking about polished helmets, Eisenhower's team was inside command tents, rewriting the entire rulebook of modern warfare. When Patton demanded salutes, the artillery crews were learning to synchronize their barrages. When he punished dirty uniforms, tank destroyer battalions were training to fight as one. It wasn't coincidence, it was strategy. Eisenhower knew morale and competence had to climb together. Soldiers had to feel like a professional army and fight like one too. By mid-March, the new U.S. Army was ready to test itself again. On March 17th, 1,943. Just 11 days after Patton took command, the 1st Infantry Division and the 1st Armored Division began their advance into central Tunisia. Their next target, the town of Gafsa, an oasis surrounded by endless desert plains. Intelligence said the Germans were waiting there, dug in and ready to fight. But when the Americans rolled in, they found little resistance. Gafsa fell almost instantly, a clean, organized victory that felt like redemption. The very next day, March 18th, the 1st Ranger Battalion, led by the fierce and fearless Lieutenant Colonel William Darby, pushed further east and captured the oasis town of El Guetar. Again, barely any shots fired. The Italian defenders took one look at the advancing Americans and retreated into the rocky hills overlooking the town, choosing distance over destruction. But that retreat wasn't surrender, it was a setup. The Italians still held the high ground, guarding the narrow El Guetar Pass, a rugged corridor leading south toward the coastal plains. If the Americans could break through that pass, they'd cut straight into the German supply lines. That single move would trap the entire Axis force in southern Tunisia, squeezed between American divisions, advancing from the west and British troops closing in from the east. The Second Corps had clawed its way back from humiliation to hope, and waiting on the other side of that mountain pass was the man determined to stop them, General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, one of the toughest commanders in Rommel's entire army. The next battle would decide whether the Americans' transformation was real or just an illusion. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, now commanding all German forces in Tunisia after Rommel's departure on March 9, 1943, saw the danger instantly. If the Americans broke through El Guetar, the entire Axis front could collapse. He knew he had to strike first, and strike hard. A quick, punishing counterattack, he thought, would be enough to shove the upstart Americans right back where they belonged in retreat. So, on March 22nd, von Arnim unleashed one of Germany's deadliest weapons, the 10th Panzer Division. This was no ordinary unit. It was a battle-hardened monster forged in fire across Europe. These were the same men who had steamrolled through France, thundered across Russia, and clashed in the deserts of North Africa. Their tank commanders were veterans who'd destroyed hundreds of enemy machines and lived to tell about it. They were masters of coordination, armor, artillery, and infantry, moving like one machine of destruction. They had never lost a major engagement, and they didn't plan to start now. To them, El Guetar was just another repeat of Kasserine Pass, the same green American troops, the same broken coordination, the same shaky leadership. They expected chaos, panic, and retreat. They expected to crush the Americans again in hours. But this time they were dead wrong. At precisely 0600 hours on March 23, 1943, the stillness of the desert shattered. 50 German tanks rolled out from a narrow mountain pass, engines roaring like thunder, sunlight flashing off their armor. The desert sky was painted gold as the sun rose behind the American lines, perfectly silhouetting the advancing column against the western ridges, a sight both beautiful and terrifying. At the head of the formation rumbled the Panzer IVs, their long-barreled 75mm guns gleaming in the early light. Behind them came Marder tank destroyers, open-topped and lethal, many armed with captured Soviet 76mm guns, brutal reminders of battles past. Following close behind were half-tracks packed with Panzer Grenadier infantry, ready to pour out and swarm American defenses. German motorcycle scouts tore ahead, engines whining as they kicked up dust, racing to locate weak points in the line. The entire column surged forward across the flat, open valley nearly 2 miles wide, confident, loud, and unstoppable. Their commanders had seen this movie before at Kasserine. The Americans would panic, scatter, and crumble under pressure. Victory seemed inevitable, but when they looked ahead, something was wrong. There was no movement, no noise, no sign of the enemy. The valley was eerily quiet. The Americans were out there somewhere. But where? Major General Terry de la Mesa, Allen of the 1st Infantry Division had prepared for this moment like his life depended on it because it did. This was not the same army that had been humiliated a month earlier. This time everything was different. Instead of one fragile defensive line, Allen had built a layered fortress across the valley. His forward companies were perched on high ground, dug into slopes with clear views of every inch of open terrain below. Their rifles and machine guns overlapped in tight interlocking fields of fire, a deadly web waiting for the first tank to roll in. Behind them, more infantry battalions were positioned in depth, each line ready to back up the next. If one was hit, the next would respond instantly. No gaps, no confusion. Artillery batteries sat hidden behind the ridges, their barrels pre-sighted on every likely approach. The gunners couldn't yet see the Germans, but they didn't have to. Their fire missions were already plotted, precise, and deadly. American forward observers, camouflaged and calm, watched from concealed perches with binoculars fixed on the advancing panzers. Every move was tracked, every range estimated. Tank destroyer battalions were dug into perfect ambush positions, hull down, camouflaged, and invisible beyond 100 yards. They had the high ground, clear fields of fire, and patience to wait for the kill shot. The infantry, now properly trained and hardened by Patton's relentless discipline, were tucked into deep reinforced foxholes, dug low enough to survive tank overruns. They weren't shallow scrapes anymore, they were fortresses in the dirt. And most importantly, this time every unit knew exactly where its neighbors were. Every radio was synced to the same frequencies, every fire direction center connected to the same network. For the first time in North Africa, the U.S. Army was fighting as one, eyes, ears, and guns all working together. The Germans thought they were charging the same confused army they'd crushed at Kasserine. What they were really charging was a reborn force, disciplined, coordinated, and hungry to prove they could fight the best army in the world and win. Every detail of the American setup had been thought through to the last bullet. Ammunition was piled high beside each gun, ready for a non-stop barrage. Medical aid stations stood ready just behind the lines, prepared to handle the wounded the moment the shooting began. Supply routes were clearly marked and heavily guarded, so no truck or ammo run would get lost under fire. And during the night, combat engineers had laid out dense minefields, placed exactly where German armor was expected to roll, based on careful study of every move the panzers had made at Kasserine Pass. This was no repeat of that chaos. This was not the scattered, panicked defense of a month before. This was a fortress, a battlefield masterpiece crafted from every lesson learned in blood. At dawn, the German tanks came rumbling across the valley floor, kicking up clouds of dust, moving fast, formation tight, confidence unshaken. They looked unstoppable, but as the column closed in 600 yards, 500, 400, the trap snapped shut. The lead tanks hit the minefield, and the world exploded. Blinding flashes erupted beneath their hulls, tracks ripped apart, steel twisted, and crews scrambled out of burning vehicles as black smoke clawed into the sky. The German line hesitated, then bunched up as tanks in the rear tried to weave around the wrecks, grinding to a halt under a haze of dust and panic. And that was the moment the Americans had been waiting for. From hidden observation posts along the ridges, forward artillery observers raised their radios and gave the signal, "Fire for effect." Every gun within range, every single one, opened up at once. The sky roared as 105mm and 155mm shells screamed overhead. Dozens of batteries fired in perfect sync, the result of weeks of drilling, calibrating, and timing. They had been tracking the German advance since the first tank appeared, adjusting their aim for range, elevation, even wind direction. Now, everything was lined up with deadly precision. The first salvo hit dead center, a thunderclap of explosions rolling through the valley. High explosive rounds smashed into armor, blowing tracks clean off and turning tanks into fiery tombs. White phosphorus shells burst overhead, raining fire molten, burning chemicals that clung to metal, cloth, and skin. Then came the second salvo before the first had even finished landing, then the third, then the fourth. For 12 straight minutes, the valley became a storm of fire and steel. German tanks tried desperately to back out, but their escape routes were blocked by burning wrecks. Half-tracks burst apart under direct hits, their thin armor no match for the rain of shrapnel. Infantry who had jumped out to clear mines found themselves caught in the open, cut down by the blast waves with nowhere to run. The 10th Panzer Division, proud, disciplined, invincible, was now trapped in its own graveyard of smoke and twisted metal. They couldn't move forward, couldn't fall back, and every minute the shells kept falling like judgment from the sky. For the first time in North Africa, the U.S. artillery was performing exactly as it had been designed, to concentrated fire, massive coordination, and perfect timing. This was everything they had failed to do at Kasserine, now unleashed at full strength. Every radio call, every plotted range, every signal was proof that the new doctrine worked and worked flawlessly. And just when the Germans thought it couldn't get worse, the Americans switched weapons. As the artillery finally lifted, the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion took over the killing. Their M3 gun motor carriages, half-tracks fitted with 75mm cannons, roared to life from concealed positions behind the ridges. These crews had trained for this moment day and night, rehearsing exactly what to do when the barrage ended. They opened fire instantly, targeting the stunned panzers struggling to regroup amid the wreckage. One by one, their shots found their mark: a tank turret ripped apart here, a half-track engulfed in flames there. Each blast echoed across the valley like thunder. The coordination between artillery, infantry, and tank destroyers was seamless, a perfectly executed trap. What had once been the Americans' greatest weakness had now become their deadliest weapon. The tank destroyer crews knew exactly what they were doing. They had studied every German move like a playbook. They understood how panzers liked to advance, when they turned, where they exposed their armor. They didn't waste ammo or fire wild. They picked their targets cool and steady, one tank at a time, waiting for that perfect shot. Each blast from their 75mm guns cracked through the desert air like thunder, and each explosion on the valley floor marked another German machine turned into a blazing wreck. And they weren't alone. From supporting positions further back, the 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion joined in, their M10 tank destroyers mounting heavy 3-inch guns that punched straight through German armor. Together, the American guns stitched fire across the valley like lightning bolts, organized, relentless, unstoppable. By 0900 hours, the German attack was shattered. 30 tanks lay destroyed or crippled across the sands, burning in thick columns of black smoke that could be seen for miles. The proud 10th Panzer Division, once unstoppable, was now in full retreat, limping back toward the mountain pass they had charged from just hours earlier. Major General Terry Allen stood at his forward command post, field glasses in hand, watching the retreat unfold. His men cheered, but he stayed calm. His orders were clear: hold El Gueter, don't chase. When 2 rogue German tanks came dangerously close to his headquarters during the height of the battle, some of his staff panicked, urging him to pull back. But Allen's response became legend. "I'll be damned if we pull out," he snapped, "and I'll shoot the first man who tries." That line would echo through every American camp from North Africa to Normandy. By the end of that day, the U.S. Army had done what many had believed impossible. They had stood their ground and beaten German armor head-on. It was the first real defensive victory of the American campaign, and it changed everything. But the Germans weren't done just yet. At 1,645 hours, von Arnim threw his 10th Panzer Division back into the fight, this time swinging from a new direction, hoping to outflank the Americans and hit them from the side. But the new U.S. Army was ready for tricks. As the panzers came rolling in again, American artillery unleashed another perfectly timed storm of shells, followed by a wave of tank destroyer fire that tore into the flank attack before it even reached the front lines. By nightfall, the field was littered with burning German armor once more. The 10th Panzer Division had been beaten back again. This time, there would be no third try. They fell back east to join the Italian divisions holding the hills beyond El Guetar, but they never attempted another breakthrough. The valley belonged to the Americans now. For the next 2 weeks, the battle around El Guetar raged on as U.S. forces tried to push through the narrow mountain passes. It was brutal, grinding work. The Italians dug into high ground around Hill 369 and Hill 772, fought like their lives depended on it, and they did. American assaults crept forward, yard by yard, slowed by mines, artillery, and machine gun nests hidden in the rocks. Progress was painful, but this time the Americans didn't crumble. They pressed on, determined and confident. Then came the turning point. On March 26, 1943, British forces under Montgomery launched Operation Supercharge II to the east, smashing through the German Meereth line and forcing Axis troops to retreat north. The trap was closing fast. By early April, the Axis position in southern Tunisia was falling apart. On April 7, 1943, American forces advancing from El Guettar linked up with elements of the British Eighth Army along the road between El Guettar and Gabes. The long-awaited connection between the two Allied armies was complete. At 1,700 hours, the remaining German forces were sealed in northern Tunisia, cut off from supplies, reinforcements, and escape. The North African campaign was all but over. The Battle of El Guettar marked the moment everything changed. It was the first time American forces had decisively beaten elite German armor in open combat. The victory didn't just save reputations, it vindicated every single reform Eisenhower had made since Kasserine Pass. The new artillery system had worked flawlessly, coordinating massed fire that annihilated the enemy. The tank destroyers, fighting as unified battalions instead of scattered platoons, had proven devastatingly effective. Combined arms, coordination infantry, armor, artillery, and air had finally clicked together in perfect rhythm. Even air support, though still not perfect, showed huge improvement. But the biggest win wasn't about equipment or tactics, it was about belief. The American soldier, once doubted by his allies and mocked by his enemies, had finally proven he could fight the best and win. After El Guettar, the Germans stopped calling U.S. troops cowards. Even Axis intelligence reports admitted it. The Americans had become tactically competent and fearless under fire. Rommel himself, already recalled to Germany 2 weeks earlier, reportedly told his staff that the Americans had learned faster than anyone expected. The message was clear: the rookie army that had stumbled at Kasserine had been reborn in the fire of El Guettar, and now, the world would never underestimate them again. Even Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, had to give the Americans their due. In his private papers, he later wrote that U.S. forces had recovered with surprising speed after their initial shock and had succeeded in damming up German advances. It wasn't praise, it was respect, the kind that only comes from one professional soldier to another. The Americans had proved they could fight. What stunned everyone wasn't just the victory, it was the speed of the transformation. Only 27 days separated the disaster at Kasserine Pass from the triumph at El Guettar. In less than a month, the U.S. Echet Corps had replaced its commander, rewritten its doctrine, retrained its men, and completely redeemed itself in battle. No other Allied army had ever adapted that fast, not even close. The British had needed years to perfect combined arms warfare after their early humiliations in France and North Africa. The Soviets had taken roughly 18 months after the German invasion in 1941 to rebuild their command structure and finally hold the line at Stalingrad. Even the Germans themselves, who had once been the masters of modern war, had required long, bloody campaigns in Poland and France to refine their famous blitzkrieg tactics. But the Americans? They pulled it off in under 4 weeks. And that wasn't luck, it was leadership. The U.S. Army's transformation was driven by a culture of brutal honesty and rapid reform. The first key was admission. American commanders didn't waste time pretending Kasserine hadn't been a disaster. There were no excuses, no cover stories, no finger-pointing. They didn't blame the soldiers who broke under pressure, they blamed themselves for sending those soldiers into impossible situations. That level of accountability was almost unheard of in wartime. Most defeated armies look for scapegoats. They blame cowardice, poor morale, or bad supplies. But Eisenhower and his team broke that cycle completely. After Kasserine, they ran a full, no-nonsense post-mortem, an unflinching autopsy of their own failures. They tore apart battle reports, studied communication breakdowns, and identified exactly where leadership, coordination, and doctrine had gone wrong. The result was a series of after-action reports so direct that they shocked even seasoned officers. There was no sugarcoating, no patriotic spin. Just cold truth and a promise to fix it. And they did. Officers who had led at Kasserine weren't shamed or forgotten. They were reassigned to training commands, where their mistakes became lessons for the next wave of officers. Their failures turned into fuel for the Army's evolution. The message was clear. No one gets blamed for falling down, only for refusing to learn how to stand back up. The second key was authority. Eisenhower had something most Allied commanders didn't: the freedom to act. He didn't need to wait for approval from Washington, D.C., or fight through miles of red tape. He didn't have to send cables begging for permission to fire Fredendall or rewrite doctrine. The War Department trusted him completely to run the North African theater his way, and that trust paid off. When Eisenhower saw a problem, he could fix it immediately. He could replace a general, reorganize an entire corps, or rewrite tactics on the fly without waiting for political approval. That speed gave the U.S. Army a decisive edge. The British, by contrast, were stuck in a bureaucratic maze. Every major decision in North Africa had to be cleared by the War Office in London, where aging desk officers, many of whom had never been near a battlefield, combed through reports and second-guessed every move. Changing doctrine required endless committee reviews, formal analyses, and signatures from officers who were fighting an entirely different war in their minds. Eisenhower's command didn't have that problem. His power in theater was absolute, and he used it to build a new kind of army, one that could think, adapt, and strike faster than anyone else. That independence, combined with unflinching self-assessment, turned the humiliation at Kasserine into the victory at El Guitar, and from that moment on, the world knew the Americans weren't just catching up anymore. They were becoming the driving force of the Allied war effort, rewriting the very rules of modern warfare in less than a month. While other armies were chained by politics and ego, the Americans were free to adapt. Soviet generals couldn't sneeze without Stalin's approval, and he cared more about appearances than tactics. Every decision had to pass through the filter of politics, not logic. A general could win a battle and still get shot for making the wrong person look bad. The Germans weren't any better off. By 1943, Hitler himself was micromanaging his commanders from a bunker in East Prussia, issuing tactical orders based on ideology instead of reality. His obsession with never retreating turned victories into suicides. Brilliant generals like Rommel and Guderian were forced to obey the delusions of a man fighting ghosts in his own mind. But the American system was different, radically different. U.S. commanders in the field had the power to make real decisions on the spot. They didn't have to beg for permission or wait for orders from Washington. They could change tactics, reorganize units, and rewrite procedures based on what they learned that very day. This decentralization, letting leaders lead, was an old American tradition, going all the way back to the Continental Army. But in World War II, it became one of the most decisive advantages on the battlefield. And the second advantage, resources, mountains of them. When Eisenhower's staff said they needed something, it didn't take months. It took weeks. The brand new M10 tank destroyers, with their sleek 3-inch guns, were shipped across the Atlantic almost as soon as they were requested, fast freighters carrying them in less than 2 weeks. Extra artillery batteries? No problem. The U.S. Army had already activated hundreds of them in 1942 and early 1943, ready to be deployed wherever needed. When Second Corps called for more firepower, the response wasn't a memo, it was a convoy. New artillery guns, spare vehicles, radios, and crates of ammunition rolled straight into North Africa. Air liaison officers, trained at freshly built schools in the States, were flown out and attached to frontline units within days. Even radio systems that didn't exist in January were being mass-produced by February and in the hands of soldiers by March. No other nation on Earth could match that speed or scale. By 1943, the American industrial machine was a miracle of steel and sweat. The factories back home were pumping out tanks, trucks, jeeps, rifles, artillery pieces, uniforms, rations, and medical gear at a pace that stunned foreign observers. It wasn't propaganda, it was power in motion. While British forces fought with outdated equipment designed in the 1,930 seconds and built in factories under constant German bombardment, and while Soviet troops struggled with supply shortages caused by a devastated homeland, the Americans were flooded with material. Even the once mighty German war machine was starting to choke. Allied bombers pounded their factories day and night. Fuel, steel, and rubber were running out. By 1943, the Wehrmacht was suffering shortages of everything from replacement tanks to spare tires. Meanwhile, if an American unit's weapon jammed too often, it was replaced. If a vehicle broke down too easily, the design was modified and mass-produced again fast. That sheer abundance of gear gave the U.S. Army something priceless: freedom to experiment. An army that's short on ammo can't afford to test new tactics. Every mistake costs too much. But an army that's overflowing with equipment, it can take risks. It can try, fail, learn, and try again without losing its edge. The Americans could test new ideas, dump what didn't work, and mass deploy what did almost instantly. And that's exactly what they did. The third great advantage of the U.S. military machine was its open mind. Unlike many armies that clung to pride and tradition, the Americans were willing to learn even from their enemies. Eisenhower's staff officers devoured every scrap of intelligence they could get on German tactics. They studied how the panzers moved, how they coordinated infantry, armor, and artillery. They watched how the Germans used terrain, how they disguised their advances, and how they crushed resistance with timing and speed. But they didn't just copy, they adapted. They spotted the flaws in German methods, the weaknesses under all that confidence, and they built counters designed to exploit them. When a tactic worked for the Germans, they asked, "Can we make it better?" When it didn't, they made sure never to repeat it. That willingness to learn and to change fast made the U.S. Army something new on the world stage, not just a massive force of numbers and machines, but a living, thinking organism that grew stronger with every fight. While other nations were ruled by fear, ideology, or pride, the Americans were ruled by one idea: progress, and that was an enemy no dictator could ever outthink. If the Germans had a smarter move, the Americans studied it, adapted it, and made it better. That mindset became their secret weapon. The fifth key to their transformation was relentless training. Patton's legendary 17-day overhaul of Second Corps was no speech-making miracle. It was raw sweat and repetition. Every day, soldiers dug and redug foxholes until they were deep enough to survive a tank rolling right over them. Tank crews drilled with infantry until their movements synced perfectly. Artillery batteries practiced coordinated fire missions again and again until they could call in support in their sleep. Tank destroyer units trained as cohesive battalions instead of scattered platoons. Even air liaison officers rehearsed airstrike calls non-stop. It was exhausting, repetitive, and laser-focused on the exact problems exposed at Kasserine Pass. By the time these troops went back into combat, every new tactic was second nature. They didn't have to think, they reacted right. Those 5 reforms: leadership overhaul, doctrine repair, new communication systems, industrial muscle, and relentless training created something the world had never seen before. An army that valued adaptation over tradition. Unlike older armies chained to decades of pride and precedent, the Americans had no sacred rules to protect. They had nothing to defend but their future. That meant they could tear down what didn't work and rebuild it overnight. The very inexperience that doomed them at Kasserine became their superpower at El Guitar. They learned fast because they had less to unlearn. Historian Gerhard Weinberg nailed it when he said the British completely misunderstood this. After Kasserine, British commanders like Montgomery and Alexander dismissed the Americans as hopeless, poorly trained, poorly led, and unlikely to improve. They wanted to stick U.S. troops on supply duty while the British handled the fighting. Even Churchill echoed that doubt in private letters to Roosevelt, convinced the Americans would need years to catch up. But they were wrong, spectacularly wrong. The British had been fighting non-stop since 1939, from France to Greece to Crete to North Africa. Their army had been knocked down, rebuilt, and bloodied again before finally earning its victory at El Alamein in 1942. That long road made them cautious and slow to change. They assumed the Americans would need the same 3 years to mature if they survived that long. Weinberg later wrote that the British couldn't grasp the obvious. If the Americans learned in a few months what had taken the British 3 years, that wasn't a weakness, it was a miracle for the entire Allied cause. The Americans' learning curve was steep because their mindset was open. They didn't protect old ideas, they challenged them. British military culture prized formal procedures, regulations, and endless paperwork before any change could be made. Every adjustment had to crawl through committees and approval boards before being tested, and by the time it was cleared, the battlefield had already changed. The Americans had no patience for that. Eisenhower's rule was brutally simple. If it doesn't work, fix it now. Don't wait for a meeting, don't draft a report, change it, test it in combat, and refine it again tomorrow. Results mattered more than tradition. That no-nonsense pragmatism, fueled by America's massive resources and flexibility, created a learning cycle measured in weeks, not years. And those lessons spread like wildfire. The new artillery coordination system became standard across the entire U.S. Army. Combined arms warfare, the tight teamwork of infantry, armor, artillery, and air was drilled into every training base from Fort Benning to Camp Polk. Tank destroyer doctrine was rewritten to focus on battalion-level coordination instead of scattered platoons. Air-ground cooperation evolved fast by the time the U.S. invaded Sicily on the 10th of July 1943. You could already see the difference. American forces in Sicily fought sharper, faster, and smarter. Communication between units was smooth. Artillery was terrifyingly accurate, and coordination between air and ground felt natural. And when the U.S. invaded Italy that September, they leveled up again. Commanders moved more aggressively, units backed each other up perfectly, and airstrikes landed exactly where they needed to. German defenses in Italy were strong, deadly strong, but they couldn't stop the American advance. The men who landed at Salerno on September 9th weren't the same troops who had fled at Kasserine. They were hardened, disciplined, professional. By June 1944, when American soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy, the transformation was complete. The U.S. Army was now one of the most lethal fighting forces in the world, with unmatched artillery precision, air dominance, integrated tactics, and experienced, confident leadership. They still made mistakes, war always does that. The hedgerow fighting in Normandy was brutal. German defenses were fierce, and progress came at a cost. But the Americans adapted again. When the hedges stopped tanks, they welded hedge cutters to the fronts. When German armor pushed back, they called in airstrikes and tank destroyers. When entrenched defenses slowed them down, they unleashed overwhelming artillery barrages that shook the ground. This adaptability forged in Tunisia became the core identity of the U.S. Army in Europe. While the British stuck to familiar methods from North Africa, and the Soviets repeated the mass assault tactics that had crushed the Germans at Stalingrad, the Americans kept evolving. The Germans tried to replay their 1940 Blitzkrieg magic, but by 1944, they were the ones scrambling to keep up. The Americans had flipped the script. They didn't adapt to the enemy anymore, the enemy had to adapt to them. This constant innovation set a tempo the Germans could never match. Every time they developed a counter, the Americans had already moved on to something new. They were fighting a force that never stopped learning. That speed of adaptation, the ability to force your enemy to react to you, became one of America's greatest weapons. And it all started in Tunisia. After the war, the lessons of Kasserine to El Guettar became the DNA of the U.S. military. After-action reviews became mandatory. Every unit was expected to analyze what went wrong and fix it fast. Commanders who failed to adapt were replaced without hesitation. Learning from mistakes became a badge of honor, not a mark of shame. Other militaries studied this phenomenon, but few could match it. The British kept their devotion to tradition and formality. The Soviets stuck to rigid, top-down control. The Germans prized bold initiative but never built a system to spread what they learned. Only the Americans created a machine that could institutionalize evolution. It wasn't that other armies couldn't change, they just couldn't change as fast. The U.S. Army's transformation between Kasserine Pass and El Guetar remains the fastest large-scale military turnaround in modern history, 27 days from total defeat to total victory. Less than 4 weeks from chaos to cohesion, from humiliation to dominance, and the effects lasted generations. Because in the end, El Guetar wasn't just about beating the 10th Panzer Division, it was about proving that failure could be turned into power, that a broken army could rebuild itself through honesty, courage, and relentless will. Major General Terry Allen stood in his command post on the evening of March 23, 1943, watching the last German tanks retreat through the smoke. His men were filthy, exhausted, and shaking but victorious. The same army that had crumbled at Kasserine was now standing tall on a battlefield they had owned. The Germans who once called them cowards were in full retreat. The British who had doubted them were rethinking everything. And the Italians who expected easy prey were now hiding in the hills, clinging to defense instead of attack. Allen didn't celebrate. He knew there was still fighting ahead. Tunisia would take 6 more weeks to clear, and the war was far from over. But something deeper had changed. The U.S. Army had proven it could do what no army in history had done before: turn disaster into doctrine. That was the real triumph of El Guetar, not just a tactical win, but a victory over failure itself. If this story hit you the way it hit us, don't let it fade into history. Hit that like button. Every click helps keep these forgotten transformations alive. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because every day we dig up the real stories that shaped our world. Stories of courage, resilience, and reinvention. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Are you tuning in from the United States, Canada, the UK, or Australia? Maybe somewhere else entirely? Our community stretches across the globe, people keeping these lessons alive, together. And if someone in your family ever served, share their story too, because remembering them is how we keep history breathing. Thank you for being part of this mission. You're not just watching history, you're helping preserve it.